Samuel Adams Lee was an accomplished author, scholar, lecturer, a gallant disabled veteran of the Civil War, a distinguished close cousin of General Robert E. Lee, and not a single one of those things is true. You're about to learn about a 19th century con man, fraud, convicted thief, forger, and severe opium addict who told those lies for 35 years throughout Pennsylvania, at least 13 other states, and England. You'll also learn how he is connected to us here in central Pennsylvania and is linked directly to a founding father of the American Revolution. First, I am disappointed to say that there are no known photos or illustrations of Samuel Adams Lee, but it's so much nicer when hearing a story to be able to picture the guy doing all of these wildly audacious things. So, since there is an image of his father, we used that and descriptions from his prison intake records to create this computer-generated image of what he may have looked like. In all reports about him, good and bad, everyone always remarked that he was polished, charming, very handsome, and had riz like no other. His full story was published this summer by the Pennsylvania History Journal, so if you want a more academic look at his life or to know any of my sources for this story, that is where you'll find it. But we're going to keep it light and fun here, or as light and fun as you can possibly keep it given the troubling subject matter. First, you gotta have his background to understand him better. As I mentioned his dad already, Richard Henry Lee, a lawyer, professor, and pastor. Does his name sound familiar? It should, because he was named after his grandfather, who was the mover and a signer of the Declaration of Independence. Coming from the great Lees of Virginia meant that this family had money and influence. As a town lawyer and the mayor of Leesburg, Virginia, he had regular correspondence with men such as John Adams, Henry Clay, and James Monroe. But he was really not vibing with the cutthroat politics of his job, so he desperately wanted to change to something that was a better fit for his gentle nature. So he got a job as a professor at Washington College in Pennsylvania, a predecessor of today's Washington and Jefferson. He packed up his family and moved from Leesburg to Washington when little Sammy Lee, the oldest son, was only about 4 years old. This is the privileged world that he grew up in. Everyone adored his father, who is said to have been a big softy and very slow to reprimand. So maybe that is why, even from a young age, people described Sammy as an unprincipled scamp. Nevertheless, in 1844, he enrolled as a 15-year-old freshman at Washington College, along with his younger brother, Richard II. This is when he began signing his name S. Adams Lee, which is what he used for his entire life. And he also became a bit of a klepto, but usually only taking smaller things, so he never got in trouble because of how well respected his father was. Then he kept making more daring thefts. During his senior year in 1847, he went to court for assault and battery, which his father got him out of. But just a few months later, he broke into the office of a former congressman and stole $200. This was big. His father couldn't save him from this one. The punishment was the catalyst for a life-altering accident. He was sentenced to 3 years at the Western State Penitentiary in Pittsburgh for larceny. But the night before he was scheduled to arrive there, he tried to escape from the county jail by setting up a plank that almost got him to the top of the wall before a guard caught him and knocked the plank out from under him. Sam plummeted to the ground and badly injured his right foot. They still took him to Western State the next day, but his injury was so bad that his foot eventually had to be amputated. And because it was the 1840s, they gave him opium for the pain because, well, they didn't know any better. Sam got a pardon for his 18th birthday after serving only 9 months of his 3-year sentence. He returned to the family home where he basically was laid up and constantly taking opium for the pain. He was so young, and who knows, maybe he could have turned his life around had the accident not happened. For several years, he acted as his father's secretary and poured himself into reading and studying classical literature and poetry from his bedroom. Soon he began writing his own poems and essays and became a frequent contributor to these publications. He also wrote many letters to other authors and poets in a way that today we'd call fan mail. Surviving letters show that he clung to the coattails of his famous ancestry so that the recipient would give his letters more attention. This starts what I like to call Act 1 of his fraudulent activity, which took place all from his home in Washington, PA. It's not nearly as exciting as Act 2 when he took his show on the road, so I'm going to gloss over much of Act 1, and again, if you want those details, you can read the full story in this issue. Basically, he managed to form a pen pal friendship with famous British poet Leigh Hunt. This guy ran in circles with the likes of Charles Dickens, John Keats, Lord Byron, Percy Shelley, and all the literary greats. Sam's introductory letter to him survives, and the nice people at the British Library were kind enough to send me a copy. He filled it with flattery for Hunt and a bunch of lies about himself. He claimed to be directly related to George Washington and that he lost his foot in the Mexican-American War at a time when he was actually in Western State Pen. There was quite an age difference between the two, but somehow Sam convinced Leigh Hunt to enter into a partnership with him for 2 literary publishings, one for poetry and one for sonnets, for which Sam would be the editor and work to get them published in America. The two friends wrote often for a period of about 2 years until after Leigh Hunt sent all of his writings. They wove an elaborate network of men to get this work accomplished. This includes future President James Buchanan, who at the time was the U.S. Minister to Great Britain, American artist and editor William Wetmore Story, and Benjamin Moran, who, like Buchanan, was a native of Franklin County and also became an American diplomat in London. They also sent each other special trinkets, like autographs of famous men and locks of their hair. Sam sent Leigh Hunt hair of George Washington and his great-grandfather Richard Henry Lee. Hunt sent Sam a lock from John Keats and Lord Byron. These locks of hair deserve their own chapter in Sam's story because the paper trail of each piece and how they kept getting passed back and forth among men who were desperate to believe they held pieces of hair of their heroes meant that they never checked their validity. Now, after Sam got what he wanted from Leigh Hunt, his letters kind of stopped. Hunt had himself worried sick because he was supposed to get 30 pounds from the publisher. But the publisher had paid Sam, and then the money was never seen again. These works do exist. They were actually published, and S. Adams Lee's name is basically a footnote in literary history because of them. But over the next 2-year period, Sam wrote an intermittent letter or two, just enough to keep him in the good graces, because each one presented a new excuse as to why the money didn't make it across the pond yet. But what was really going on during this 2-year period is that Sam had moved on and was corresponding with other men, such as famous historian Benjamin Lossing, to whom he sent a book that supposedly belonged to George Washington and regifted the locks of hair that Hunt sent to him. But he also sent some of these locks to other men, such as poets George Henry Boker and Paul Hayne. Now, all of these men's estates boasted for decades that they had these locks. Talk about splitting hairs. It's a convoluted and complicated paper trail, and one of these is even in a museum in Iowa. And I'd bet money that it's a piece of Sam's own hair that they have in their collection instead. Finally, in August of 1859, Sam penned a long mea culpa letter to Leigh Hunt. He claimed to have been in a 19th century version of rehab for his opium addiction and described the tortures of the damned in great detail. discussed his parents' health battles, his father's disappointment in him, pondered if he might even still have a place in heaven due to his drug use, and came up with a grandiose excuse as to why the money never got to Hunt, claiming that he himself had been swindled by a shipper. This was likely a lie, and unfortunately, Hunt might have never even received this letter because he died just a few weeks after it was sent. Sam got what he wanted, though. He was starting to achieve some literary fame thanks to Leigh Hunt. Most critics were very complimentary of Sam's contributions to the project, but not everyone was a fan. My favorite scathing review was, "It is plain from the beginning that he has nothing to say, and we cannot withhold our admiration of his prolonged success in saying nothing in such neatly rounded periods and elegant language." Still, he continued to be a contributor to other publications, and you can truly feel his deep depression behind the flowery prose of his poetry. His writing was fanciful and dramatic, though doused in sorrow and melancholy. So now we've made it to the Civil War years. His younger brother, Richard II, was a leader at Fort Pitt Iron Works, helping make supplies for the Union, such as guns for naval ships. Another younger brother, Philip Ludwell Lee, enlisted and served for the Union, eventually becoming a career officer for the Buffalo Soldiers out west after the war. But two of his older half-siblings were living in the South, and of course, being native Virginians, you can imagine that their views during this time were complex. Then in January of 1865, his beloved father died. This man that Sam spent his whole life trying and failing to emulate was gone. He was the oldest, but he couldn't take care of their ailing mother due to his own disability and addiction. So his younger brother, Richard II, stepped up. This was at the same time that he had accepted a new job as the superintendent of Freedom Iron Works in Mifflin County, Pennsylvania. So Richard moved his own family, as well as their mother, Sam, and another younger brother, across the state to central Pennsylvania. This home is where they lived in Burnham and is currently a funeral home. But the next year, when their mother died, who was always Sam's protector, all bets were off. Richard II was certainly not going to placate his big brother's antics and threaten his reputation in their new home. The family black sheep was now excommunicated. And now we begin Act 2 for our Sammy. An orphan in his 30s with a disability and dependency, and he had to figure out how to survive on his own. For the next 16 years, he would steal anything from a shin plaster to a woman's heart throughout many towns in each of these states. He invented a new backstory, and this was his M.O. Arrive in a new town and introduce himself to men of influence as an author and scholar who was interested in giving a lecture in town. Gain sympathy by claiming the loss of his foot was due to the Civil War Battle of Hampton Roads, where he was a captain. When he was in a northern state, he claimed he was a Union officer who lost it aboard the Monitor. When he was in a southern state, he claimed he was a Confederate officer who lost it aboard the Merrimack. Name drop. Say that Robert E. Lee was a close cousin and that he came from a distinguished ancestry. Produce forged letters from people like Jefferson Davis or George Washington Custis Lee that praised him. Receive rave reviews in all of the newspapers and become everyone's favorite new fascinating person. Give the same 2 lectures, either God in the Ocean or a glorious depiction of that naval battle in which he lost his foot. Get a job teaching at the town's academy or female seminary. Tie charities to his lecture, but pocket the money. Start writing to rich, sympathetic men in other towns and beg for money to publish a book or try to sell historic relics and those locks of hair. Now here is where we insert people starting to get suspicious. Could he be an imposter? Steal the charity money from the lectures, steal whatever he could from the school, fund the getaway and the opium supply, Skip town, rinse and repeat. This Act 2 journey began in the summer of 1866, shortly after his mother's death, when he arrived in neighboring Juniata County. He got a job teaching at Tuscarora Academy and the McAllisterville Soldiers' Orphan School. Newspapers raved about him at first. He even delivered his God in the Ocean address at the Juniata County Courthouse to raise money for the Juniata Cornet Band. He was set to give lectures at Bloomfield Academy in Perry County and the Female Seminary at Selinsgrove, but by the spring of 1876, he had absconded to Philadelphia with items that he stole from Tuscarora Academy and the McAllisterville School. The woman teacher that he stole from in McAllisterville pressed charges for the theft of her gold watch. By May, detectives in Philadelphia found him with the stolen items. S. Adams Lee became prisoner number 5827 at the Eastern State Penitentiary for 1 year, charged with larceny. The Juniata Sentinel wrote about the whole ordeal and said, "By his cunning devices, he won the confidence and esteem of almost every person. He was very desirous to procure some place to spend the summer months where he would be free from the temptations of the intoxicating cup, stating that he had acquired an appetite for strong drink and wanted to reform. Being rather an intelligent young man, he figured very conspicuously as an orator, delivering several very interesting and instructive lectures. He failed in his goal of reforming because when he couldn't get whiskey, he used opium in large quantities. Lee has been in the habit of writing to literary men in our large cities, stating that he had written a book of a certain character and not having the means to get it published, would ask donations. And only the other day, a check for $80 came to this place for him from some gentleman in Philadelphia. The order was returned to the donor, stating that this celebrated author was now rusticating in the suburbs of Philadelphia. Thus, another of the many rascals who play upon our unsuspecting and liberal-minded people has been caught up and justice done him. If he did not find a place in our county where he could reform, he has certainly found it in Philadelphia." Now, Sam's opium use was in the form of a morphine drink and pill or gum opium. There has been no evidence that he used it hypodermically. Opiates were widely used by this point and not difficult to get. It wasn't well known or warned how dangerously addicting it was. It was used quite frequently for Civil War veterans. But Sam was not a veteran and had already been taking opiates for 20 years at this point, ever since he was a minor at age 17. Would his life have been different if that accident had never happened? Well, it certainly would have been much easier. While he was in Eastern State, he wrote to Cyrus Hall McCormick, the inventor of this brand. He tried selling McCormick a complete set of autographs of the signers of the Declaration of Independence. McCormick was smart and passed. After Sam was released, he took off to start the cycle again. Now, when I say people raved about him when he first came to town, I mean they basically groveled. Here's just a couple of reviews, for example. A literary treat of more than ordinary excellence. The facts stated and the true eloquence and elegance of the speaker in style and manner were captivating. The large auditory were spellbound by the thrilling narrative. It was one of the most thrillingly eloquent and sublimely beautiful productions that we ever listened to. All who heard him are agreed that for sublimity of thought, purity of language, and practical sense and impressive delivery, it could not have been added to. He became transcendent, and some old men stated that they had not been so aroused since the fall of the Confederacy. Our gallant and maimed Captain Lee even dropped some tears while talking about his alleged participation in the Battle of Hampton Roads, a true flair for the dramatic. Just a few of the places that he traveled and repeated this same cycle were the Charlotte Female Institute in Charlotte, North Carolina, the Dunbar Female Institute in Winchester, Virginia. Here, an official eventually got suspicious and wrote a letter to General Lee himself, who responded that he had never heard of S. Adams Lee. The Judson Female Institute in Marion, Alabama. Here, he tried to raise money for scholarships to educate the daughters of deceased Confederate clergymen and to rebuild a local church that had just had a fire. He also came up with a new charity, the Lee Memorial Fund, to build a monument to the great Virginia Lees. But soon, the trustees began to get suspicious that he was an imposter. But he met with them and pled his case well. He showed them all of the items and relics that he had from American history, which he said were passed down to him through generations of Lees. These forgeries appeared to have every mark of authenticity, enough to convince them that he was legitimate and he got to keep his job longer. Soon, though, he got caught red-handed stealing rare books and was dismissed. By the way, before his father died, he documented that all of the items that he had from American history were not, in fact, passed down to any of his children, but instead were donated to places like Harvard and the University of Virginia. Soule College in Murfreesboro, Tennessee. Here, he was overheard making bad remarks about the women in that town. So when some men confronted him, he was like, "Oh, no, I would never. I'm a gentleman. I'm a cousin of General Lee, for goodness sakes." And he even produced one of his forged letters from the general's son vouching for his reputation. But these men didn't buy it, and they wrote a letter to Fitzhugh Lee, while the head of the college sent one to George Washington Custis Lee. Unsurprisingly, both responded, "Who?" The press played a pretty big role in Sam's Act 2, because once a town found out the truth and admitted that they had been fooled, its local papers would print far and wide, warning other towns to watch out for him. The warnings were scathing. Here are some of my favorite descriptors: unmitigated deadbeat, miserable impostor, irresponsible swindler, errant knave, impudent scion, unfortunate cripple, disgraced lecturer, degenerate rascal, a daring adventurer, nefarious operator, one-footed cuss, the greatest liar that ever trod shoe leather, and the biggest humbug that ever allowed his middle name to protrude. Now, there were smart people in some of these towns who weren't fooled by him for a second, some having visceral negative reactions from the onset. But when they voiced their concerns that his facade was just a mirage, they were in the minority. Sam's supporters were terribly offended by the accusations and were willing to mob his accusers. He even ran into some people who he would have actually served with had he been at Hampton Roads. People who said, "Well, you weren't in my command," or "You don't appear on the wounded list." Even when people pointed out evidence that the uniform he always wore was wrong for his stated rank and unit, his supporters would hear none of it. They were the reason that he had the confidence to be so shameless and bold. While newspaper warnings managed to save some towns, for others, if they had read the warnings, got goldfish brain and immediately forgot about it when this smooth-talking hottie arrived at their train depots. And that's exactly what happened in Frankfort, Kentucky, where a scene was about to play out as if it was scripted in Hollywood. Sam got a job teaching at Henry Female College in nearby Newcastle. There, he met his greatest love, 26-year-old teacher Emma Lucinda Hawks. The two shared the same literary tastes and soon were in love and planning to elope. But that's when the rumors of some of his bad deeds started circulating. Emma broke the engagement and returned to her home in Rochester, New York. He declared that he could not and would not live without her, which worried her because she did care for him. She wrote him a letter to assure him that she would remain his friend and she wished him well. Then she received a telegram from someone named Mr. Sandford in Frankfort, Kentucky, informing her that Sam shot himself in the chest and was not expected to live. She asked to be kept informed and eventually received a letter from Sam himself which said he didn't want to live, and he begged her not to tell anyone, especially the press, because he didn't want it known that the manner of his death was suicide. Then she received a telegram from Mr. Sanford that said if the bullet could be removed from Sam's lung, he would live. He was begging for Emma to come see him. She talked the matter over with her mother, and they were convinced that this is genuine because no one could telegraph such distressing news unless it were true. They believed that this was enough to prove his love and decided she ought to return to Kentucky and marry him after all. Maybe it would inspire him to have hope and live. So she arranged to have Sam meet her just before Valentine's Day, 1872, in Eminence, Kentucky. From there, they rode the train together to Frankfort. During the trip, a weakened Sam said that the bullet was removed and showed her a handkerchief with bloodstains from the wound. But as Emma was about to find out, not only was there no Mr. Sanford, there had also been no suicide attempt either. The two disembarked from the train and checked into a Frankfurt hotel with plans to be married later in its parlor. Meanwhile, some of the townsmen discovered the elopement plan and set about to stop it. These men included General John C. Breckinridge, who was the former Vice President of the United States, and Colonel J. Stoddard Johnson, a newspaper editor. Both sympathetic men were easily conned out of money by our cunning Sammy just weeks before. They were joined by the county district attorney and half a dozen other former Confederate officers and leading townsmen. With the intention of stopping the wedding and saving this respectable young lady from ruin and disgrace, this vigilante posse went to the hotel and confronted the couple with proof of the groom-to-be's schemes. In a rare move, Sam admitted to everything, but said that his actions were because he suffered from opium addiction. He even revealed a tin box filled with his medicine as proof. A large crowd had gathered, and threats of violence began against this Confederate fraud. The men were still sensitive to his addiction and his disability, so rather than arrest him, they ordered him to leave the county on the next train and never return. He regrettably and angrily agreed. As he was about to board the train, Emma was still in complete shock and disbelief amid this flurry of activity. She was about to marry a consummate villain, and yet still cared for him and even kissed him farewell at his departure. One newspaper wrote, Captain Lee, with rueful countenance, got aboard a sadder and even more single man than he had expected to be. All evening, Emma labored over her thoughts and recollections, trying to make sense of it all, and even, at times, doubting the accusations against him, but ultimately returned to Rochester. Journalists were anxious to get his side of the story. Unsurprisingly, Sam felt the whole ordeal was unfair. He claims to be a stranger in a strange land, misunderstood and unjustly accused, and took his sudden discomfiture very hard. He had explained to the lady, prior to their engagement, all of the circumstances of his life and had never deceived her in any respect. He suffers constantly from his wound, and during our interview, took from his pocket a tin snuff box filled with gum opium, and rolling out 6 or 8 pills, swallowed them down to drown his troubles. He gave utterance to but one regret. I wish I had taken her to Louisville instead of Frankfort. He also claimed that he never said he was more than a second cousin of General Lee, but my research revealed he was a fourth cousin once removed. He blamed the press for sensationalizing a closer relation, even though the forged letters he carried with him stated otherwise. For a man of more than ordinary intelligence, S. Adams Lee was getting careless. Newspapers across America rejoiced in this story, with towns that he had victimized joining together via press almost like a support group. Editor Johnston made it his life's mission to stop Sam from victimizing others. He started collecting letters from men across America who had been fooled, with details even more rich and racy than were revealed in the press. Through this free exchange of information, it was revealed that even God in the Ocean was stolen, as it was identical to a piece by a French poet. You would think after an embarrassing close call like that our Sammy might lie low for a while, but nope, he dug in his heels and kept getting worse. After hitting a few more towns in Kentucky, he tried his luck going north to Illinois and Indiana. At Ferry Hall Lake Forest Seminary, all the girls fell desperately in love with his irresistible charm. But they soon learned the harsh lesson that all that glitters is not gold, and were heartbroken when he was caught stealing valuable books. Then he went to Memphis with a forged letter from Jefferson Davis and said he was raising money for Confederate orphans, but he himself was the orphan he was gathering money for. Then he tried out pretending to be a minister in Georgia and Alabama. But his luck ran out in Oxford, Alabama, where he got to work hustling right away by cozying up to the town's newspaper editor. A bold move considering he had just left the editor's parents' home in Talladega, where he stole a book of poems, some coins, and a gold hook. It wasn't long before the editor got a letter from his parents, and a search party entered Sam's hotel room. He denied the accusations while walking over to his fireplace and taking an opium pill, while fiddling with something on the floor with his only foot. It was the gold hook. So he confessed and told them where they could also find the book of poems. It was sealed up, nicely packaged, and addressed to his love, Emma, in Rochester. He trembled in court and said he would rather be killed than go back to prison. But he got 1 month for larceny at the Calhoun County Jail. While he was there, communities rejoiced, but knew that it wouldn't reform him. He will come from jail to re-enter upon a career of unparalleled and unblushing fraud and effrontery. But by now, you know our Sammy. He didn't wait until he was released to start hustling again. He carried on his enterprise by writing more letters in his cell and even got money back. Upon his release, newspapers once again issued warnings. He can be readily identified by a missing foot. He is a most consummate hypocrite and swindler. He almost got a job at a female school in Paris, Texas, but the press apparently worked faster than the HR department, so he went to Delhi, Louisiana instead, where he closed out an impressively chaotic 1872. From here, he continued letter-writing schemes and outright stealing. One of these money-begging letters from Louisiana survives. It said, "If you only knew all my circumstances, the endless discouragements, the physical pain and mental anxiety I suffer, the cruel disappointments, God alone knows how hard I have labored, hoping to gain some literary reputation. Utterly cast down, sick at heart, and weary of life itself. A few short years ago, I had a happy home. Now, wife, father, mother, and sisters are all gone, and crippled, dependent, and weary-hearted, I am left alone to battle with a heartless world." And then he went on to try to sell the recipient Thomas Jefferson's original first draft of the Declaration of Independence and some letters from Andrew Jackson about the Mistress Eaton scandal, and of course, more locks of hair. Sam was sure to steal a couple more gold watches before fleeing to St. Louis, Missouri in early 1873 and attempting to get a job at a female school there. And you are not going to believe this. Guess who he used as a character reference? Colonel J. Stoddard Johnson, the very man whose life mission it was to ruin S. Adams Lee. Johnston responded, "For the information of all heads of female seminaries, whom he seems to take special delight in swindling, that fellow's proper place is in the penitentiary and not a professor's chair." When the people of St. Louis discovered that they had been conned, one of their newspapers perfectly summed up how all of his victims felt. Since the days of Monroe Edwards, no man so accomplished in rascality, so impudent in his schemes, and so pious in his pretensions, has illuminated the criminal records of the United States and excited admiration by the effrontery of his operations as S. Adams Lee. There has been no man until now who made rascality a study and devoted all the energies of his life to its perpetration. It may be set down as an axiom that when any man assumes to stand on an elevation above the common level of humanity, he is a fraud and a humbug. This is especially the case if the pretensions are to peculiar piety or virtue. Only he who uses the cloak of sanctity for sinister ends is ever clamorous for recognition as a model of virtue. And now comes along another pious candidate for infamous distinction in the person of S. Adams Lee, a young man of honorable descent, high cultivation, good address, and some claims to genius, who, throwing all these splendid advantages, which, if properly utilized, would lead him to an enviable career, descends to a pitiful role of a chevalier d'industrie. Sam didn't care, though. He had already made his way to Cincinnati with a pocket full of recommendations and introductions and an enormous bundle of railroad and steamboat passes. He started stealing clothing from the coat racks of the offices of the Cincinnati, Indianapolis, and Lafayette Railroad. When his trunk was searched at the boarding house, all the stolen items were found. He made up a strange story about an uncle who would only give him food if he gave him a piece of clothing daily. Off to court he went and again was jailed for larceny. Court records haven't been located, but S. Adams Lee was absent from the press from May 1873 until December of 1875. In January of 1876, he went back to Illinois, where he changed his sympathy story by claiming that he lost his entire fortune of $17,000 to Duncan Sherman and Company, a New York banking firm that went bankrupt. After hearing his lectures, the good people in Mattoon opened their hearts and their wallets to help him. But soon, a list of the actual victims of the bank's failure was published, and guess who wasn't on it? S. Adams Lee's life story is winding down. His love, Emma, left Rochester in 1874 to teach in Los Angeles, but a few years later, she returned to Rochester for a nude teaching job. Coincidentally, Sam showed up right around this time in a neighboring county, lecturing at the Livingston County Historical Society in January 1879. He spoke about his drug addiction and the Battle of Hampton Roads. One of the leaders of this society was Dr. Daniel Fitzhugh. He was known for being an extremely hospitable man, so he moved Sam in with the family at their ancestral estate called Hampton. Sam got a job teaching at the Lady Jane Grey School in nearby Mount Morris. At the close of the school year, he was invited to spend the summer at the home of Dr. Fitzhugh's son, William Dana Fitzhugh, at their family estate called the Hermitage. A letter survives from William's daughter Cornelia, who was 14 years old at the time. My father and grandfather both entertained him as a distinguished Virginian. He proved such a pleasant and interesting guest that he remained as one of the family for nearly a year. He was unmarried, dressed always in the blue uniform, quite lame, and not very strong. Sam was also an unlikely companion of Cornelia's 4-year-old nephew, Hamilton Wright, who later told her that his association with old Captain Lee had a lasting influence on his literary thought and habits. They were devoted comrades, the lame old soldier and the little boy. Now, this was rare for Sam to stay in one place this long, So he really did bond with this family and feel accepted. Maybe the first time he felt like part of a family since he was kicked out of Mifflin County 13 years before. He did eventually make his way to Rochester. While there, Sam reported that a homeless man had stolen his wallet on the streetcar, but soon the press found out Captain S. Adams Lee, formerly of Mount Morris, has proven to be a kleptomaniac. He has been stealing cigars and perfumery in Rochester. Then on December 10, 1881, Sam was admitted to the Monroe County Insane Asylum for treatment of his addiction. However, just 10 weeks later, on February 18, 1882, he died from an opium overdose at the age of 52. According to Cordelia's letter, he died in a hospital from an overdose of morphine, a sick and lowly man. The attendants found a note from him to my father asking to be buried in our little cemetery, and that was done with every attention and honor. I was a very young girl and not given to problems, but I do remember hearing the family comment on the fact that though we knew him so intimately, we knew little or nothing of his early life and his family. That probably is why no word was ever sent to them of his death. Before receiving this letter from the Livingston County historian, I always wondered how he managed to get buried in this small family cemetery and why his gravestone forever immortalized him as a naval captain and had the wrong death date. Perhaps that was the date of the letter that he wrote to Fitzhugh. Whatever became of all the falsified historic documents and locks of hair that he carried around with him for all those years? If there were any papers of his, they may have been returned with the body. However, the Fitzhugh estate was lost to fire about a decade later. Now, you may be asking how people were so gullible back then. Looking at these foolish, good-natured people 150 years ago might be the same way that we may be looked upon in another 150 years for buying into misinformation campaigns and a constant barrage of fraudulent scams via text message, email, and social media. The times may have changed, but the people generally have not. The fact that Sam wrote a last request letter indicates that the overdose was not accidental. And there will always be the lingering thought that wonders if Lee was only doing what he had to do to survive. He had dreams of achieving literary fame, but despite his intelligence and privilege, he didn't execute it in the proper way. He no longer had any familial support system and was living with addiction and a disability. And there is plenty of evidence in his writing that suggests he likely also had clinical depression. Perhaps he thought he had no other option. From his room at the Mount Morris School, he wrote in detail about his drug use. Slowly but steadily and ceaselessly, I was pushed by some invisible power neath my feet, up into the vast realms of infinity, on and on, through countless ages of time. I ascended into those regions of nothingness which are far beyond the utmost verge of creation. Part of the time I was in impenetrable gloom, with feelings of awful sadness, and part of the time in a radiant flood of glory, and my soul was steeped in a bliss unutterable. My perceptions became dim and confused. My skin was hot and parched as by the heat of a furnace, while the blood roamed through my veins like a mighty river, and thundered in my ears with the noise of many cataracts. Gradually, I sank into a melancholy stupor, from which I awoke 18 hours afterwards, with nerves all unstrung and mind and body depressed. So what do you think? Were his actions because of his addiction, or the mind of a troubled genius with an indignant privilege? Well, we hope you've enjoyed this story about S. Adams Lee, whose trail of interstate destruction began right here in Juniata County.